Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked about AppSec metrics and how they should influence and not distract a security program. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, save $100 on your RSA Conference 2022 full conference pass. RSA Conference will be live in San Francisco this June 6th through 9th. Security Weekly will be there in full force, delivering real-time live coverage and interviewing some of the event's top speakers and sponsors. To register using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC2022 and use the code 52UCyber. We hope to see you there. And do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review those suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. We get to keep talking, John. Thank you for sticking around because we've got actually a lot of articles this week, and I want to start maybe with a view to the future. I've got something about our robot overlords, but you've also got an article about post-quantum in our quantum future. So maybe let's just kick off with that. Yes, exactly.
Sure. Yeah. So okay, well, let's see. This is, we'll give a tiny bit of background for folks who might not be up to speed on this. Some number of people out there in the world have started sniffing and storing encrypted traffic with the sole goal of just keeping it stored on disk until some point in the future when quantum computing, I might have to start doing rainbow hands on quantum computing too, but yes. Quantum computing is, how will I say, real enough that it's able to crack our current encryption, which we believe to be, good enough for today, but maybe not good enough for the future. It's certain known that the NSA does this in the US. I believe some of the larger countries in Asia do this, and probably someone in Europe is doing it too. So when you see someone when you see a government organization suddenly building a very large data center, that's probably what they're doing, is they're just storing stuff away in it. OpenSSH has this on their mind. So with version 9.0, which was released on the 8th of April, they have changed the default, I'll get myself back up to speed. I was reading this last week. They've changed the default key exchange. And basically what they've done is they're using, it's actually in my show notes, remember right. Come on, John, catch up. So what they've done is they've moved over to something called streamlined NTRU prime plus X25519 key exchange. And what this is doing, long story short, is they've come up with a, if I remember right, it's a lattice-based encryption that they're using for the key exchange, which will then hopefully make it more difficult for someone in the future to be able to just, magically quantum and decrypt what's going on with this data. So I don't know, Mike, if that makes a little more sense to you. I was a little more up to speed on it last week when I was reading it, but at the end of the day, it's just something, the reason I brought it up was something interesting for folks to think about as we figure out which forms of cryptography and key exchange should we be selecting for our applications. It's not just do we want to be secure for now, but secure for the future, or how long do we care about that type of thing? So, interesting topic.
It's an interesting topic, and I think, one of the aspects just to highlight is I think an easy way to, or at least one way to summarize this is that it's the shift from cryptographic algorithms that are based on factorization, because that is what the threat of quantum computing is that there are ostensibly quantum algorithms that could be created to make factoring much easier than can be done today. And I think one of the other things that I'll throw out there is that Cloudflare actually, if you go to their blog and search for post-quantum, they have a lot of really good, more detailed even, blog posts and articles describing just what the quantum threat is, what does it mean to be a post-quantum algorithm. In other words, like you briefly mentioned, like lattice-based, what are some algorithms that are more resistant to the idea of just fast factorization. So I'll throw that out there, and we can, for listeners, and we can pick up on more of that as we go throughout the year. But it is a really good way of just highlighting, here are some consequential decisions within an application that are how am I trying to say this, that are forward looking, but that are good to see now, but are probably going to take quite a while to roll out and adopt, because users still have their their factor algorithm, RSA based keys essentially. So you need to roll out, how do you change those? How do you get your user population? How do you get your servers to start making those switches? But the fact that you have software to support it is, it gets into that chicken and egg type of issue. So you can at least start that planning, if you will. The other planning for the future, we've got a whole bunch of vulnerabilities to talk about. I'll dive into one about robots and basically medical IoT devices. This was a interesting article because it's about 5 days, but more just about 5 flaws that a company discovered, Scenario, if I'm pronouncing them correctly. And I linked to their PDF because thank you very much for not putting this PDF behind a registry wall or some type of marketing wall that you have to sign up for in order to read the PDF. But it's 5 vulns that they discovered in basically some robots that can be deployed within a hospital to basically bring supplies from point A to point B. So these aren't types of robots that are doing surgery or something consequential like that, but they're roaming around. And what's more interesting is that the robots of our future are storing passwords using MD5 hashing. That was a bit of like, wait, what? And another one of the vulns they found was a very straightforward, dead simple, one of my favorite catchphrases, cross-site scripting. So it's one of those areas that seems like, sure, we can make fun of IoT and things like that, but these are not consumer, I'll kindly say, I don't think I can kindly say garbage IoT, but consumer grade IoT, where that might just be build up, deploy quickly, and then forget about it because they were worth $50. These are, robots deployed into a medical area. Yes, exactly. Not cheap. And so it's really surprising to see these types of issues like just MD5 hashing of passwords, because these also fall into that solved problem category. And I think that's what gets me frustrated, or that's what gets me wanting to make more fun of these situations, because we have things that are frameworks that make cross-site scripting so much more difficult to introduce. There's no reason to be using MD5 hashing for the password storage. So those are the things, the aspects of this that stood out to me that just sort of deflated my sense of optimism for our AppSec future.
I want to tie this back a little bit to what we were talking about before, the whole aspect of, I don't know how long these guys have been around. I'm giving them the benefit of doubt and go call them a relatively young company. I don't think they've been building hospital robots for 20 years. Maybe they have, but let's call them a startup. Let's call them a startup which was focusing on how do we get FDA approval to run in a hospital, and that's probably where their core focus has been. So when Sally was asked to write the website and the authentication system for it, she didn't know any better because her last company, she was out for 20 years and they were using MD5. So suddenly you've got MD5 in this product because you're not going to take time to figure out what's the best way to do it unless you have some idiot like me around. So that's a possibility of how this got there, to sort of give a little bit of human chance. But I think what's interesting to think about, this is something we've been talking about with a lot of folks, my startup has been, is the due diligence which we do, which an organization does either for a purchase or an acquisition or whatever else, an investment. Very seldom do we seriously look at security. So it's gotten better. Bessemer's been sort of championed, Bessemer Venture Partners, a VC in Silicon Valley. They've been championing this for, I think, over 10 years now. But it's still only slowly catching on in the startup investment space, not alone the rest of the world. So I'm willing to bet that it'd be interesting to go and look, but I'm willing to bet if we went out to the FDA and try to track down what checklists are needed to bring a non-invasive robot or a non-invasive technology in general into a hospital, I'm guessing the security checklist is pretty low down on that list, and it is sort of just a checkbox. So how do we get those type of organizations to improve? We're slowly seeing governments around the world starting to require more security compliance. Definitely in the U.S. we're seeing it. But how do we push that further and have it have not so much? I'm not looking for the teeth aspect of it, but I'm looking for the. I want you to actually think about this more than just hand wavy. And the response from the company is going to be, but that's expensive, because again, back to our last half hour, is all this type of stuff you're doing is all really difficult and complex, and it's not easy to understand or parse all these type of things. So I get both sides of it. We're slowly moving in the right direction, but hopefully it gets a little more traction sooner rather than later.
Hopefully it does. And we've seen, there's these MD5 cross-site scripting. You also grabbed a couple of articles on, once again, this is going to be maybe my catchphrase, some dead simple vulns, especially SQL as a service in AWS. Uh-oh.
So this one's dead simple, but it's also really interesting. Let's where that tab is. No need a tab. I can talk through it. So what's going on here is how to describe. So one of Amazon, AWS, Amazon Web Services, not Amazon, they've got something called RDS, their database as a service, which you can select either using a MySQL or a Postgres compatible, or actually Postgres database in the backend. So the idea here, what the fine folks over at Amazon doing, well, not fine folks, but also like tons of folks, right? They've got these huge engineering teams. So they take an open source project like one of these guys, and then you think, okay, I want to be able to run that in a cost-efficient manner at scale, right? The reason a lot of people go to work at Amazon is like you don't see that scale anyone else, same as like Google and all these big guys. So how do I take Postgres? I want to run it at scale so that we've got, I don't know their numbers. I should, but I don't. 50 million customers are able to go and click and spin up a database and have it come up quickly, have that be a whole thing be scalable, have it not be super expensive for us in the back end. So all these different aspects to it, right? And then also we need to be able to secure that thing. So if I'm running 50 copies of a Postgres database, and Mike, you've got one, I've got one, I can't see your data, you can't see mine. That has to obviously be, in a shared tenancy. This is the thing is we need to have that completely separate and secure and all that type of thing. So that's the overall, the backstory here of describing through, because that alone by itself is not easy to do. I mean, yes, you could have just an EC2 instance per each one and just do that. But that's going to be expensive, not going to scale. It'll scale well, but it's not, there's probably better ways to do it. So what is that? And then in the case with Postgres, or a lot of these modern open source systems, this is the part which is interesting to me. Postgres in particular has a plugin and a module system, so you can add functionality into it, right? First one coming to my mind is Timescale, which is another database which basically adds time series to Postgres. Now I do want to find this article because here we go. Because they list off 2 or 3. There was something called a log FTW extension, which I'm guessing is some sort of logging thing. I should have tracked it down, but I didn't. But so what this researcher did, she was trying to figure out how to get in. Could she get in down to what's going on underneath Postgres? And she kept poking and poking and poking. And then she got to the modules and kept poking around. And she realized on this one module that there was something, the error message she was getting a little bit different. So she got that, as I always say, that the finger hold. So the error message she was getting when she was trying to do what she was doing was a little different. And then she realized, oh, they've got another security module that they're adding in that's securing this and stopping me from getting down to the file system. And she figured out, since she had root access in Postgres, she could actually disable the other module, the security module from Amazon, and then get down to the file system and start reading and writing. And she was able to find a set of IAM credentials for an internal Amazon service called Grover. And Amazon's not commenting on what Grover does. I'm sure it'll come out in coming weeks. But so basically that was the end game, right? She was able to get credentials off the box for another service and probably could have gone further with it. But the takeaway is it's so difficult to do this stuff and do it right. And we're seeing a pattern of this right now. I think the first one started around October. I can't remember if Azure or AWS was first last year, but we're seeing people, the researchers and probably attackers too, are figuring out, a new way to try and use these services to get in underneath and start extending their access. So something to think about both if you are a cloud user, depending on your risk level, how do you secure against something like this happening? And then also, if you think about going to those companies or building your own cloud, if you happen to be that stupid, I say that with love because I was that stupid at one point. But that's different aspects to think about this and try to go down this path.
No, it's great, and I do love that. I linked to also the blog write-up by the researcher into our Discord. And one of the things I just have to also highlight that I love, part of her thought process was, hey, let's try some path traversal in here. And that path traversal attempt was also what led to that, this error message looks a little bit different that you highlighted, and then kind of pulling back what happened. So once again, it's one of those articles. It's a nice walkthrough of the attacker mentality, the attacker technique, which is one of the reasons we like to highlight these types of articles. So kudos to that researcher for some cool finding. And I'm going to pull in another article that again falls into the dead simple category. This is essentially cross-site scripting payloads in an NFT marketplace. But I'm going to try to hand wave and just skip over all of the NFT gruff and all that junkiness aspect of it. The article covers a nice walkthrough of code, so it's worth reading for that. But it also highlights an aspect that I think we can generalize from this type of scenario, in the sense that users were confused about the consequences of what they were signing. Meaning, a user might sign some code, or they might sign a transaction to say, yeah, this transaction is fine, but not understand what the consequences of saying, I just signed this. And the consequences in this case were, I could transfer your NFT from you to any other wallet I wanted to. And that type of scenario, that the massive security failure consequence due to an unhelpful user experience, an unhelpful UX, reminds me of things like the old school article about why Johnny can't encrypt, talking about GPG. Or, we've had the longest time of, for so long, phishing countermeasures and phishing security awarenesses were talking about things like, look for that little lock icon on your browser, which doesn't help anyone because that little lock icon is confusing. It doesn't really mean secure. It just means the certificate was authenticated and correct for this particular domain name, but doesn't carry any other bearing around that. So that was just kind of the lesson I wanted to pull from here, in the sense of, in general, if you're designing sensitive actions, security consequential actions, how does the user experience and the user education about whether, what does this mean to take feature X, to click yes, to click no, or to accept or deny something. These are tough problems to solve. So that's sort of just, wanted to throw that aspect of this into your threat models as you're talking with your development teams.
Now, don't forget, Mike, if the address bar has the green thing, then it means it really is secure.
It means you paid a little bit more for that certificate, yes.
You have more money than sense. I almost missed them. You know what's interesting about this is, and this comes back to my, I don't want to say it's a standard gripe about certificate security, but it's our public key security, but it sort of is in that, right? So big fan of public key security, but the question always comes down to, okay, which algorithms do you use? And like you saw us trying to cover the other stuff before with, I've happily forgotten about it already. But anyways, keeping going. We recently were getting our Apple developer certificates so we can do signed binaries. I don't know if you've gone through that process, but I've got the screenshot around here somewhere. I might put it in Discord. The list of different certificates that you can get from Apple. And the reason I'm mentioning this is a multi-billion as well, $1 trillion company now, I believe, that has pretty much all the resources or sources they need, that they actually care about user design and user experience and all these type of things, at least on the consumer side of their products. And still, no joke, there was probably 20 different types of certificates I could have radio buttoned. I don't think it was checklists. I think they were radio buttons. So you're like, which one of these do I want? And it's sort of the same thing here, right? So, in both cases, at least in the Apple case, it's a developer side thing, not a general user side thing. Like, I think this is a little more public. But yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's what you said, is how can we, this stuff needs to be really mind-numbingly simple and built in and secure. And it's funny, I've been thinking over the weekend, we hadn't covered a crypto article for a while, so thanks for pointing that one out. But yeah, and we've covered that one enough. Who's next?
If you do want to find some more crypto articles, check out Trail of Bits. On their blog, they have a recent write-up on the Rarible marketplace. And I mentioned that because I did pull another article from Trail of Bits, once again about crypto, as in the math version of crypto, the good math version. And this one, I'm going to hand wave over a lot of the details because I don't think I think a lot of eyes will glaze over if we try to get into the details of Girol bulletproofs and Plonk implementations of zero knowledge systems, zero knowledge proofs. But the reason I highlighted this is for our few listenership who do want to get into the details of quantum algorithms, post-quantum algorithms, and other crypto stuff. But there was one line in here that stood out to me, is that a lot of what this flaws boil down to, in the article quote, comes down to a combination of ambiguous descriptions in academic papers and a general lack of guidance around these protocols. Now, I probably could have just taken that quote and say, guess what this is describing? And it might have touched on anything from an authentication scheme for OAuth, that's called foreshadowing, to Kerberos, to encryption itself, to implementing OpenSSH, or the differences between OpenSSH and GPG for that matter in terms of trust models. But we can also switch to, are we talking about HTTP 1 or HTTP 2 or HTTP 3 for that matter? And it's this lack of guidance and good implementation guidance around protocols that where a lot of these problems stem from. So my one final comment on that is that you can have a really nice, formally proved algorithm and application. So it's formally proved secure, but you get into the implementation side of things and oops, we made a mistake, we misunderstood an order of operations, or there was a subtle logical flaw in there that unfortunately our fuzzers probably aren't going to find so easily, or that we still need those human brains to get. So eventually, John, we'll get to the point where we can still do our rainbow hands when we talk about human brains solving problems rather than AI and ML. So that's the best I got for that. I don't know if there's anything else interesting there for you if you want to hit another article.
That would be amazing. In short note, there's nothing else interesting for me to say on this. No, keep going.
Sure.
It's interesting from the point of view, I think, like you said, I hope our listeners get a sense here, right, of, the two of us obviously, our likes and interest in even application security, which is a pretty small field, are obviously very, we've got our tastes. And I'm just mentioning that from, for the point of view of our listeners, if you're coming up in AppSec or you're trying to figure out if this is cool to you, if you've got a math background or you like math, all this stuff is like catnip. There's, once you start talking formal proofs, you get, really great white papers out of there. You'll probably just, be at your heart's content reading this stuff for the rest of the day. That's not me. That's all.
No, unfortunately, John is probably still busy working on those top 10 security metrics that we were talking about last segment, things like reproducible builds, and which is important for software supply chain security. So I did, of course, find an article to keep our software supply chain security stories going 100% on every single week. This one is from GitHub. Now, there were two articles, actually, two blog posts from GitHub this week. One was about a vulnerability in Git that was unrelated to this OAuth tokens theft problem, and was that article was more about a path traversal-esque type of situation. So I just want to highlight it for that, but it's more about the Windows population out there. Skipping over that to talk about OAuth tokens. This was interesting to me because once again, it talks about, or it touches on the aspects that we have talked about of using SaaS, using SaaS services to put together your CI/CD workflows, your pipelines, and try not to build so much in-house, and then hooking up a Git to a Jenkins, for example, or there's a long list of different vendors we could name as we're building this CI/CD pipeline. But this pipeline does introduce, of course, that attack surface of who's accessing it. And there's humans that access it, but in this case, there's also automation services, our machines that are accessing it. And if those tokens are compromised in any way, whether they're hard-coded tokens or they're not protected in secret stores very well and attackers are able to get them, using a token is the best backdoor into a system. And if you're using a token to get into a backdoor of how software is being built, you can muck about with the integrity of that. And depending on how you do that, where you do that, you may also be able to modify the SBOM and say, here is the SBOM of the compromised and backdoored system that was built in ostensibly a trusted model. So this is just I'm basically illustrating that to say that there's a lot of complication here, and to get into something like a SALSA level 3, which was briefly alluded to in Phil's article that we talked about in last session. But mostly just to say, if you do have anything that handles OAuth tokens, whether it's on the consumer side facing, you can have OAuth tokens to hook into Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. Make sure you have workflows for revoking them and rotating them. And anytime you think that a user's password may be compromised, you not only do you need to reset those passwords, but you need to reset all of the entry points into that account, meaning OAuth tokens as well. So that's sort of my PSA for the day.
I haven't read this particular version of this article. The last time I was looking at this last week, I don't think it was clear yet how the attacker was actually getting the tokens. I don't think.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it still wasn't clear that it was just compromise picked up off of hard-coded secrets, something like that. Who knows?
Yeah. But just at the end of the day, what's besides saying that, as we trust GitHub more and more, they're doing a pretty incredible job, right? Like, we hear stories like this occasionally, but they're always in third parties. My previous, God, I hope I don't jinx myself by saying this. My previous startups, I'd always have my own private Git repos, usually GitLab. This time I'm actually trusting GitHub. I've gained enough faith in what they're doing that I think there's a reasonable, it's reasonable for me to assume that I can do that securely. It's still a big risk, right? At some point, I might bring it back internally, to be honest. And I think that it's an incredible statement to say that GitHub has done this so well for so long. It shouldn't be an incredible thing, but it is, right, in today's world. But at the same time, as you were saying, if you are doing something which handles OAuth tokens, please make sure you're doing it correctly. This is one of those areas. It's a little how would I say? It can be tricky, sort of similar to, we were just talking about certificates, and it's like, how do you pick the right way to be doing this? But there's a lot of blog posts and things out there which are, I would say, sloppy in how they describe the use of or the implementation of OAuth as a consumer. So just make sure you're doing it right. That's probably one of those things to, if you have a checklist of things you go back through every quarterly or annually, is our auth really, is that done right? Is there anything, can I look at a blog post like this and figure out maybe there's some way for me to improve? Because you don't want to be the person that's saying that due to a security weakness in our system, we compromised your source code on another platform that we didn't have, and that's not a pleasant feeling.
Not a pleasant feeling. But and in the spirit of, on the topic of things like authentication, LDAP is often a important component to authentication and identity. You've got something here around Nginx and LDAP as well.
On the topic of not a pleasant feeling, LDAP. Yeah, so this came out of, it's funny, when I first saw this, actually even here, I first saw this from another blog post somewhere else. Nginx is now owned by F5. That's the part that sort of caught me off guard, but at least short term. So Nginx has an LDAP module for doing, allowing authentication through through Nginx without having to go and write that stuff yourself. And someone figured out that there's a fairly unique sort of way to, if that module is enabled, where you're able to get a remote code execution. I believe this has a pretty high CVSS on it as a result of that. But basically, that's sort of the gist of it. They've got 2 or 3 different ways to mitigate it. It wasn't too much worth covering. I guess what could be interesting to think about is who nowadays is using this. The way they're sort of blowing it off, and I sort of agree with them a little bit, I think is while this is available in Nginx, I personally haven't. I mean, Nginx is still being used as a proxy in container environments. Would you do it with LDAP? I don't think so, maybe. So I think the use case for it is pretty small. But for folks out there that are using that, that would be something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and probably just maybe a good way to talk about the subtle distinction between CVSS as a measure of severity versus what is the risk of this, and what am I impacted by this, just because this is present? Meaning, is it vulnerable by default? Is it vulnerable in my current configuration? Is it accessible? If so, by who? So often a high CVSS score can fall down, hopefully, fingers crossed, to a lower risk type of vulnerability that you can get to on a 7-day, 30-day sort of patch cycle, as opposed to all hands on deck, 24 hours, this needs to be resolved immediately. And in the spirit of also just thinking about vulnerabilities, I did pull in an article from Google Project Zero, which I admit I do always enjoy reading their posts. This is an article about a vulnerability, honestly, from 2021, and wanted to skip over the specifics and the technical write-up of what the vulnerability itself was, and more about the strategic thinking, if you will, or the fundamental thinking of a question that the article even asks: why wasn't this found by fuzzing? And it touches one of my favorite topics, as John was mentioning, the things that stand out to me versus what stand out to him. I always love talking about fuzzing, but I do have to, I suppose, to be fair and say fuzzing isn't the silver bullet, or pick whatever marketing term you want to describe a vendor solution or an open source solution. And what's interesting about this is talking about, it may be the case that it wasn't being fuzzed, because there's another aspect here, is that this vulnerability in ASN.1 parsing, which if you just have to say ASN.1 and you can ask, how many vulnerabilities did they find? Because it's notorious for being flawed. And it was pointing out that Mozilla, Google have a lot of parsing for this area of the code, but maybe Apple doesn't. And this was an Apple fork where they found this vulnerability. And it also just kind of made me think back to our original discussion last segment about legacy systems and, choosing our tech stacks. And I don't think we've often come across many areas where we've said, we definitely do want to fork this open source project for ourselves, or we want to fork this for reasons so that we can keep it maintained or keep this up. Because often forking a repository, forking a project, can bring these types of, call them discontinuities, divergences from the main, and mispatches, or miss that many eyeballs aspect, if you will. So it's just kind of an interesting thing if we want to talk about what are the trade-offs between forking a project that is actually actively maintained, as well as, we want to roll out fuzzing. Is fuzzing going to help us? Or let's make sure that we understand where fuzzing, the types of vulnerabilities or the investments we do need to make on fuzzing, so we don't just say, here's a black hole, let's drop in some money in engineering time and cross our fingers and hope it finds something. So a little bit of, I guess, sobering thought around those topics for me.
There's 2 things here. Yeah, one, let's on the cost of fuzzing quickly. The thing is, you can't just, I can't just grab a laptop in the corner and just let the fuzzer run on it. It's not just the time. It's not just the time aspect of it, but it's also the configuration part of, are you fuzzing the right thing? Are you fuzzing with the right type of data? Right. And that's sort of the part, right? I mean, I'd love to just, take an EC2 instance or whatever, a server in the garage or something, and just go and bang away and see what happens. It's not just brute forcing a password, I guess would be a good example. It's, you have to know the configuration of the password. That might make an interesting comparison for some of our listeners. But back on this with your comment around forking. So one of the things that's on our mind recently, there's a open source package out there which does some work and saves it to a database, but it's not a database which we're using. And I'm already using 2 databases. I don't really want to, I know this third database quite well, but I don't want to be running 3 different databases and be charged for 3 different databases and blah, 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 blah. I'd love to and what we're doing basically is, even with that third database, is we're just e-tailing the data back into one of our other 2 databases we use. For a large company, no problem, get another DBA, let them deal with it. For a small company, I don't want to be juggling 3 different databases. But so what we're thinking about, since it's open source, is, could we spend a weekend hackathon and just add support for one of our databases into this open source package? Which, yes, we could, right? It's been pretty well written. We can do that. But the question comes down to the first question I asked when I heard one of my guys was talking to the open source team, their team, was asking them if we write that, would they take the donation? In other words, could we make it part of the product? Because otherwise, if I don't do that, right, then I am in this fork situation where I've got a version of this software internally that has our database code in it, and then every time they do a release, I've got to start doing this merging and crap like that. Again, it's not a situation you want to be if you can avoid it at pretty much any costs. And my previous life, I was doing that a lot for good reasons. If there's good reasons, it's a core thing for you, that's cool and fine. But if it's something you're consuming, if that's the last thing I want to do, because I know what's going to happen, right? Even right now, we had a package which we're not using in prod that we not updating as frequently as I'd like to, because they're doing a pretty good job at doing their release cycles. This another open source package, and that means every time they do a new release, I've got to go and bump the version in ECS and then test it and blah 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 blah, make sure it works with our stuff and all this type of thing. And that can get kicked down the roads too. And the last thing I want to do with that is if I have to also be doing it on a fork project. So, I guess the other question to ask there, if I want to go down that path, is, are their unit tests good enough? Because maybe if they are, I can fork it and add my code and then unit test to see that it has the functionality I want. If you can avoid that, this is one of the beauties of not just contributing back to open source, but an open source project being open-minded and open armed to I hate the phrase, but pull requests accepted. If they'll actually take new functionality and understand the benefit it brings to other users. Just other aspects of this to think about.
It is, and we unfortunately are always up against the unavoidable march of time, bringing us here to the end. There was also what rhymes with time is Chime, and you did mention this article in the previous segment, but maybe you could close us out with any quick final thoughts that you wanted to squeeze in if there was something left about this one in metrics.
Still have the tab left open. I think the final thought I'll leave folks with is it's worth a read. I think what they're doing is interesting. And this is, again, Chime has this project called Monocle for folks to listen to the first half, which you should obviously go back and do. And Action That, this is part 1 blog, right? So it sounds like they're going to have another part coming along, Mike, so maybe we'll cover that in the future and sort of wrap these 2 up into one.
Sounds good. So keep your eye on Monocle. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, John, as always, for helping us walk through all of the news of the week. Thanks for everybody listening to us and hanging out in Discord. Please subscribe, give us a like, check out the show notes. And speaking of metrics about things to watch out for, check out the synthwave and chiptune styling of Watch Out for Snakes. And with that, we'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.